My granddaughter slipped a folded piece of paper under my coffee mug on Saturday morning while her stepfather was outside checking the mail. She didn't say a word, just pressed it flat against the table with two fingers, looked at me once, and walked back to the living room like nothing had happened. I unfolded it slowly. Grandpa, the blue folder in his home office, bottom drawer, back left. Look at what he's been doing to Mom's accounts. Don't let him know I found it. Please hurry. I sat there with that note in my hand for a long moment. The coffee had gone cold. Outside, I could hear him, my son-in-law Aldrich, laughing at something on his phone. My daughter Fiona was still asleep upstairs. She'd been sleeping a lot lately. Let me start at the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what our family looked like before Aldrich came into it. My name is Gordon. I'm 69 years old. I live in Lexington, Kentucky, in the same house where I raised my daughter after her mother, Rosemary, passed away from a brain aneurysm 11 years ago. Rosemary went on a Thursday afternoon. She'd been laughing at something on television when it happened. The doctors told me she felt nothing. I've held on to that for 11 years, like it's the only thing keeping me upright. Fiona took it hard in the way quiet people take hard things. She folded it inside herself and kept moving. She finished her degree, got her accounting job, bought a small house in Frankfurt. She called me every Sunday. We had a rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. My granddaughter Sloane was born 8 years ago from a relationship that didn't last. Fiona raised her mostly alone, with my help on weekends when I'd drive the 40 minutes to Frankfurt and take Sloane to the farmer's market or the library, while Fiona caught up on sleep or laundry or whatever it is single mothers spend Saturday mornings catching up on. Sloane is 8 years old now, but she's 8 in the way some children are 8, with eyes that take in more than they let on, and a mouth that stays shut when she's decided something is important. Aldrich came into the picture about 2 years ago. Fiona met him at a work conference in Nashville. He was a financial consultant, or said he was. He was 44, broad-shouldered, with an easy smile and a habit of picking up the check before anyone could reach for their wallet. On our first meeting, he shook my hand too firmly and told me I had a remarkable daughter. I remember thinking, this man has practiced this. But I didn't say anything, because Fiona was smiling, and I had not seen her smile like that in a very long time. They dated for 9 months, and then got married in a small ceremony in Lexington. I was there. I walked her down the aisle. I gave a toast about Rosemary, about how proud she would have been. I meant every word of it. Aldrich moved into Fiona's house in Frankfurt. That was the first thing that felt slightly off. I'd assumed they'd find something new together, a fresh start. But he said Fiona's house was perfect, that he loved it, that he didn't want to uproot Sloane's life. It seemed thoughtful at the time. About 8 months after the wedding, I started noticing things. Fiona sounded tired on our Sunday calls. Not the regular tired of a woman working full-time and raising a child. Something flatter than that, something drained. When I asked, she said work was stressful. There'd been a system migration at her firm. Everyone was overwhelmed. Then I noticed she'd stopped mentioning her friends. Fiona had a close group, women she'd known since college, a few from Sloane's school. She used to mention them by name regularly. Then she didn't. In March, I drove out for Sloane's birthday. The house felt different in a way I couldn't name precisely. Quieter, maybe. Aldrich was warm and attentive, bringing out the cake, making sure everyone had drinks, leading the singing. But Fiona moved through the party like she was slightly behind herself, like there was a half-second delay between what was happening and when it registered on her face. I pulled her aside in the kitchen and asked if she was sleeping enough. She said she was fine, just a little run down, that Aldrich thought she might be anemic and had been making her iron meals. That phrase stayed with me. Aldrich thought she might be anemic. Fiona had spent 41 years managing her own health without anyone diagnosing her from across the dinner table. But I filed it away and drove back to Lexington and told myself I was being a suspicious old man. Then came that Saturday in June. I'd driven out for a regular weekend visit. Aldrich greeted me at the door, took my jacket, offered me coffee. Fiona was still upstairs, sleeping in, he said. She'd been so exhausted lately. Sloane came downstairs in her pajamas and sat beside me at the kitchen table while Aldrich went to check the mail. That's when she put the note under my mug. I read it twice. Then I folded it and put it in my shirt pocket. When Aldrich came back inside, I was looking at my phone. He asked if I wanted a tour of the garden. He'd been putting in raised beds, very proud of them. I said I'd love to see. We spent 20 minutes walking around the backyard while he talked about tomato varieties and compost ratios. I nodded and asked questions and felt the note pressing against my chest like a coal. Fiona came down around 10. She looked pale in a way that photographs don't capture, not sick exactly, just diminished, like something had been quietly removed from her. She hugged me for a long time, which she didn't always do. I held on and tried to remember the last time she'd hugged me like that. We had breakfast. Aldrich made eggs, very competent, very cheerful. Sloane sat across from me and ate her toast and didn't look at me directly and didn't look at Aldrich at all. After breakfast, Aldrich took a call in the backyard. Something work-related, he said, wouldn't be long. Fiona started washing dishes. Sloane came and stood next to me and said, very quietly, without turning her head, "Did you read it?" "I did. Will you look?" "Yes, when I can." She nodded once and walked away. I told Fiona I needed to use the restroom, and would she mind if I went upstairs? The one down here was having issues with the pressure. A lie, but a small one. She said, of course, go ahead. The home office was at the end of the hall. The door was half open. I went in and pulled it mostly closed behind me and stood very still for a moment, listening. I could hear Fiona running water downstairs. Aldrich's voice outside, low and even, still on the phone. The bottom drawer of the filing cabinet was locked. I stood there looking at it. Sloane had said bottom drawer, back left. She hadn't mentioned it was locked. Then I noticed the small magnetic key holder stuck to the underside of the desks, the kind you buy at a hardware store. Fiona had always kept spare keys this way ever since she was a teenager. It drove me crazy. I'd told her 100 times. The key fit. Inside the drawer was a blue folder, just as Sloane had described. I pulled it out and opened it on the desk and began to read. It took me about 4 minutes to understand what I was looking at. 4 minutes during which the water continued running downstairs, and Aldrich's voice continued outside, and the house sat completely still around me. There were bank statements. Fiona's personal savings account, which I'd helped her set up right after Rosemary died, the account I'd put a portion of my own money into to help her get started. The balance had been $48,000 18 months ago. It was now $3,200. There were transfers, regular ones, every 2 to 3 weeks, ranging from $1,500 to $4,000, all going to an account I didn't recognize. The memo lines were blank or listed things like home renovation or shared expenses. There had been no major home renovation. The house looked exactly as it always had. Behind the bank statements was something else, a document with both their names on it and a notary stamp, and Aldrich's signature large and deliberate at the bottom. It was a beneficiary change form for Fiona's life insurance policy. She had a policy she'd taken out when Sloane was born, $350,000, with Sloane listed as the primary beneficiary and me as secondary. This form changed the primary beneficiary to Aldrich. It was dated 4 months ago. Sloane's name had been removed entirely. I photographed everything with my phone. Every page, every transfer, the beneficiary form, the account numbers. I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it, closed the drawer, replaced the key, and walked back to the bathroom and flushed the toilet, and washed my hands and stood looking at my reflection in the mirror for about 30 seconds. Then I went back downstairs. That evening after dinner, I helped Fiona dry dishes while Aldrich put Sloane to bed. I kept my voice even and chatted about nothing. A neighbor's new fence, a woodworking project I was starting, and watched my daughter out of the corner of my eye and thought about how to say what needed to be said without saying it yet. Because I wasn't ready. I needed to understand more. I needed to know whether what I'd found was what I thought it was, or whether there was an explanation I hadn't considered. I drove back to Lexington that night and sat at my kitchen table until midnight. The transfers had started 5 months into the marriage. Not immediately. He'd waited. He'd been patient. Patient enough to let Fiona fall in love with him, to let her trust him, to let him gain access to her accounts and her paperwork and her life. I thought about Fiona's exhaustion, the sleeping in, the friends she no longer mentioned, the anemia Aldrich had decided she probably had. I thought about the word anemia. Then I thought about other things. I have a neighbor named Crawford who spent 30 years as a county sheriff before retiring. We play chess on Thursday evenings. I called him at 11:30 that night, which I'd never done, and he answered on the second ring without complaint. I told him what I'd found. He listened without interrupting, which is a habit of his that I've always appreciated. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Gordon, the exhaustion, the confusion, the sleeping. Before you jump to the worst conclusion, take her to a doctor. Independent of Aldrich, just the two of you. Get blood work done. She won't go without telling Aldrich. Then you need a reason that doesn't raise flags. Tell her you want company at your own appointment. Tell her the doctor wants a family history. She'll see through that maybe. But she trusts you. That's still worth something. He also told me to contact a lawyer about the beneficiary form, whether it was legal, whether it could have been signed under duress, what options existed, and he told me not to confront Aldrich. Not yet. I didn't sleep that night. Just lay in the dark and thought about my daughter at 41, pale and slow, and sleeping too much, and my granddaughter at 8 years old, pressing a folded note under a coffee mug because she didn't know who else to tell. The next morning I called Fiona and told her I'd been having some dizziness, that my doctor wanted blood work done, that I hated going alone and would she come with me. I said I'd take her to lunch after. There was a pause. Then she said, "Of course, Dad. When?" We went on Wednesday. I'd called ahead and spoken to the doctor myself, an old friend, Dr. Pembroke, who'd known our family for 20 years. I explained the situation quietly and asked if he could, during the appointment, suggest blood work for Fiona as well. A routine thing. Nothing alarming. He did. He was smooth about it, mentioned offhand that he was seeing a lot of fatigue in patients lately, and would she mind if he ran a quick panel, just to have a baseline since he hadn't seen her in a while. Fiona agreed easily. She didn't mention it to Aldrich before we went. I'd told her I didn't want to make it a big deal, and she understood that. We had lunch after, at a small Italian place she'd loved since college. She ordered soup and barely touched it. I watched her stir it and tried to figure out how to say, "I'm scared something is happening to you, and I think the man you married might be the reason." I didn't say it. I was waiting for Dr. Pembroke. He called me 3 days later. Fiona's iron was low, which could explain some fatigue. But there was something else. Her sodium levels were elevated in a pattern that interested him. He used careful language, as doctors do, but what he said underneath the careful language was, "This is not a natural presentation." He was going to refer her to a specialist, and he was going to document everything carefully, and he wanted to know if I had any information about what she'd been eating or drinking regularly. I told him about Aldrich making her meals, about the iron-rich food. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd be in touch. I called Crawford that same evening. He came over and we sat at my kitchen table, and I told him everything Dr. Pembroke had told me, and he sat with his hands around his coffee cup and didn't say anything for a long time. "We need someone else in that house," he said finally. "Someone who can watch what's being put in her food. How do I get in there without him knowing what I'm doing?" "You're her father. You show up." The next morning I called Fiona and told her I'd been thinking about her and wanted to visit for a few days, that I had some shelves I'd been meaning to build for her kitchen, and I might as well do it now while I had the time. She sounded pleased. I said I'd come Friday. I packed clothes and my tools. At the bottom of the bag, wrapped in a flannel shirt, I put 3 small wireless cameras I'd ordered 2-day shipping after talking to Crawford. He'd talked me through setting them up. They were simple enough, motion-activated, fed to an app on my phone. When I arrived, Aldrich greeted me with the same practiced warmth and offered to carry my bag. I thanked him and kept it. While he was outside moving his car to make room in the driveway, I moved through the kitchen quickly. 1 camera behind the small succulent on the windowsill above the sink, clear view of the counter and the stovetop. 1 in the dining room, tucked behind a picture frame on the sideboard. I worked fast, hands steady, and was back in the living room by the time he came through the door. Sloane appeared at the top of the stairs when she heard my voice. She came down carefully and gave me a hug that lasted a little too long for a casual Saturday. "You okay?" I said into the top of her head. "Yes," she said, which meant, "Not really, but I'm holding on." Dinner that evening was pot roast. Aldrich made it. I watched him move around the kitchen from the doorway, asking about my project, keeping up easy conversation. He was good at this, the kind of good that takes deliberate practice. Fiona's plate looked the same as everyone else's. No obvious moment of separation, no visible addition. I watched carefully and saw nothing. But I kept the camera running. That night, past midnight, I was lying in the guest room, watching the app feed on my phone, with the brightness turned all the way down. The house was quiet. I watched the kitchen in green-tinted night mode. At 12:40, Aldrich came downstairs alone. He moved like someone who had done this many times. No hesitation, no stumbling around in the dark. He went straight to the cabinet above the refrigerator and took down a small dark bottle and a medicine dropper. He measured something into a glass of water, stirred it with a spoon, then set the glass on the counter closest to where Fiona always sat for breakfast. He rinsed the dropper in the sink, put the bottle back, went upstairs. I lay there in the dark for a long time, watching the still kitchen and the glass of water sitting on the counter, and I understood completely. I did not sleep. At 5:30 in the morning I got up, went quietly downstairs, and poured that glass of water down the drain. I washed it and replaced it in the cabinet. I made a pot of coffee and sat at the table and waited. Aldrich came down at 6:45. He moved to the counter where the glass had been, looked at the empty space for a moment, and then looked at me. "Morning," I said. Couldn't sleep. Helped myself to the coffee. "Hope that's all right." "Of course." His face reset quickly. He made himself a mug. "You're an early riser. Always have been. Used to drive Rosemary crazy." He smiled and asked about the shelves I was planning. I told him about the dimensions. We talked for 20 minutes about woodworking. He was very good at talking about things he didn't care about. Fiona came down at 7:30 looking, somehow, slightly better than she had the day before. A little more present. The absence of whatever had been in that glass. One morning of absence. And she seemed marginally more like herself. Sloane came down at 8 and looked at the counter near Fiona's usual spot, and then looked at me, and I gave her the smallest nod I could manage. Crawford came by mid-morning under the pretense of returning a level I'd supposedly lent him. He hadn't been inside 2 minutes before he'd seen enough of the setup, and he stepped back outside with me under the guise of checking my truck. "I got it on video," I said. 12:40 last night. He dosed her morning drink. Crawford looked at the yard, not at me. "I made some calls yesterday. An old detective I worked with, still active. He wants to see what you have. Does he need more than the video? He'd like the bottle, or a sample. Something they can test. How do I get that without him knowing?" Crawford thought for a moment. "You stay one more night. Same thing happens again, probably. This time you get down there before he does. Move the bottle while he's asleep. Or get a sample first. Pour the water out. Put the bottle back." That night I set an alarm for midnight on vibrate. At 12:15 I was in the kitchen, dark except for the under-cabinet light above the stove. I found the dark bottle in the cabinet above the refrigerator without difficulty. It was unmarked. I photographed the label that was barely there, a faded pharmacist-style sticker with a string of letters I didn't recognize. I took the small dropper sample tube from the kit Crawford's had pressed into my hand before leaving and drew out enough to fill it, capped it, put it in my pocket. Then I stood in my daughter's kitchen in the dark and listened to the house, and felt something I don't have a precise word for. Not rage exactly, and not grief exactly. More like the way a current feels moving under still water. I replaced the bottle. I went back upstairs. I lay on the guest bed and stared at the ceiling with the sample tube in my fist. Crawford's contact moved fast. By Thursday we had results. The substance was a sedative compound. Not available over the counter, the kind that would require a prescription or a specific source to obtain. Used in higher doses, it could cause severe disorientation, long-term cognitive impairment, organ stress. In the doses being administered, small, cumulative, over months, it would produce exactly what Fiona had been showing. Fatigue, confusion, the slow erosion of herself. Crawford's contact brought in a colleague from financial crimes when I showed them the bank records, the transfers, the amounts, the timing, the beneficiary change. They didn't need me to explain what they were looking at. The warrant came on a Monday. I was in Lexington when Crawford called to tell me it had been issued. I drove to Frankfurt. Fiona didn't know I was coming. I arrived 20 minutes before the detectives. Aldrich answered the door and looked at me with the same smooth warmth and said, "What a nice surprise." I came inside and sat down in the living room and looked at my daughter, sitting across from me with her hands around a mug, and I said quietly, "Fiona, I need you to listen to me. I need you to not say anything until I'm done." I had about 8 minutes before the doorbell rang, I told her. All of it. The note Sloane had passed me. The folder, the transfers, the beneficiary form, the camera footage, the sample from the bottle. She didn't say anything. Her face went through several things I don't have the right to describe in detail because they were too private, too much hers. When I finished, she looked at her coffee mug on the table. She'd been about to drink from it when I started talking. She set it down very slowly and pushed it away. The doorbell rang. Aldrich came out of the kitchen when he heard it and opened the door, and the two detectives introduced themselves and showed him the warrant. His face changed, not dramatically. It was a small change, the way a mask shifts when the string holding it breaks. He looked past them at me, sitting in the living room, and I looked back at him, and I didn't look away. They found the bottle where I'd replaced it. They found a second one in his car. They found Fiona's laptop, which he'd had the login for, which he'd been using to make transfers while she slept, which had browser history going back 18 months into her financial accounts, her insurance portal, her savings. They found something else in a briefcase in the back of his car. Documents from a previous marriage. A settlement from an ex-wife in Arizona who had been diagnosed with cognitive decline at 43, who had signed over a substantial portion of her assets to Aldrich before the marriage dissolved, whose family had tried to challenge the settlement and been unable to produce enough evidence. She hadn't known to look for a bottle in a kitchen cabinet. Fiona knew, because Sloane had known to leave a note. The medical team that treated Fiona over the following weeks confirmed that she'd been dosed regularly over approximately 14 months. 14 months. The cognitive effects were reversible, the doctors said. It would take time, several months of being off the compound. But there was no permanent damage. Her body was already beginning to clear it. Sloane stayed with me during the hardest part of it. We drove to see Fiona at the treatment facility twice a week and brought her the things she asked for. Her own tea from home, specific library books she'd loved since her 20s, photographs of Rosemary that I dug out from boxes in my garage. Sloane drew her mother pictures, the way small children do without self-consciousness. Crayon drawings of the three of us, our family without the addition that had tried to hollow it out. One evening, Sloane was quiet the whole drive home, looking out the window at the passing exits. When we pulled into my driveway, she said, still looking forward, "Was it my fault it took so long?" I turned off the engine and sat there. "No," I said. "You were 8 years old and you figured out what every adult around you had missed. You found the folder. You got the note to me. Everything that came after, that started with you." She thought about that. "I was scared you wouldn't believe me," she said. "I know, but I did." She nodded. Then she got out of the car and went inside to get ready for bed, and I sat in the driveway alone for a few minutes in the dark. The trial took 11 months. Aldrich was charged with financial fraud, elder exploitation, because my money had passed through Fiona's account to his, and criminal poisoning. The Arizona ex-wife's family was located, and their testimony was included. A third woman was identified in the subsequent investigation, a girlfriend from 15 years ago who had experienced a period of unexplained illness that she'd never been able to account for. He was sentenced to 31 years. The judge called it a predatory pattern with documented victims across more than a decade, and used the word calculated several times, and looked at Aldrich when she said it. Fiona made a full recovery. It took 8 months before she said she felt completely like herself again, but the version of herself she came back to was different in the way that people are different after surviving something. She was quieter about some things and louder about others. She moved into a new house, smaller, with a yard Sloane immediately claimed as her territory. She went back to her friends, the women she'd stopped mentioning. She called them one by one and told them what had happened, and every single one of them came. I still drive out to Frankfurt every Saturday. We go to the farmer's market. Sloane picks out bread and cheese, and whatever vegetable she's decided she likes that week. Fiona drinks coffee from a thermos she brought herself, standing in the morning sun, and sometimes she looks so much like her mother that I have to find something else to look at for a moment. I've thought about what to say when people ask me what happened, and I've settled on this. Pay attention to the children around you. Not just to what they say, but to what they don't say, and how their eyes move, and when they go still. Sloane couldn't have walked up to me at that kitchen table and said something is wrong with my mother, and I think her husband is doing it on purpose. She was 8. That was too enormous for words. But she found another way. She used what she had, a piece of paper, a pen, and a grandfather she still trusted. That trust is the thing. If I'd been distracted, dismissive, too caught up in not wanting to see what I didn't want to see, she might have given up. Gone quiet the way children go quiet when they learn that adults prefer comfortable explanations. I didn't dismiss her. That's the only thing I did right from the beginning. Everything else was just following where she'd already pointed. Aldrich saw our family as an equation, Assets and liabilities, accounts to drain, people to neutralize. He came in with patience and charm and a plan that had apparently worked before, and he almost ran it to completion. What he didn't calculate was Sloane. She's 9 now. She's started talking about being a doctor someday, or possibly a detective. She changes her mind every few weeks. Whatever she chooses, she'll be formidable at it. I'm already certain of that. Fiona calls me every Sunday again like she used to. The conversations are different now. Longer. We don't fill the silence the same way, and we don't need to. We've been in the places together that most families only circle around the edges of, and something about that changes what needs to be said and what can just be felt. Last Sunday she called, and we talked for an hour, and at the end she said, "I keep thinking about how close it was." I said, "I know. If Sloane hadn't, I know." She was quiet for a moment. "We're okay, Dad. I know that too, and we are. Not the same kind of okay as before, but maybe a sturdier kind. The kind that's been tested and held." Some mornings I still wake up at 5:30 and lie there in the quiet and think about a glass of water sitting on a kitchen counter in the dark, and everything that was in it, and everything it was meant to do. And then I think about a folded piece of paper pressed under a coffee mug by 2 small fingers, and how that one small act of courage was the thing that made the difference. That's the whole story. A little girl who paid attention, an old man who listened, and a family that, against the particular odds stacked against it, made it through another day together. That's enough. That's everything.